The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. With the dual pressures of Western sanctions and low oil prices squeezing his nation's economy, and Russia's ongoing involvement in Ukraine putting him at odds with his neighbors and indeed much of the world, Vladimir Putin may have a bit of trouble mustering much New Year's cheer. We'll look today at the clouds on the Kremlin's horizon in 2015 and explore what Mr. Putin's government might do in response in the months ahead. Joining us once again in the studio today is Jeffrey Sommers, Associate Professor of Political Economy at UW-Milwaukee and Senior Fellow at the Institute of World Affairs. He also serves as visiting faculty at the Stockholm School of Economics in Riga. Jeff, welcome back.
Great to be here. Thank you, Doug.
Well, we have to ask, first of all, you were just recently in Moscow and just at sort of the retail level. What was the mood on the street?
Well, quite dark. I mean, just as it is outside. So the sun doesn't really skirt anything more than the horizon, and people's sentiments and mood seems to follow that. I mean, right now people are quite concerned about the value of the ruble. They're concerned about their future prospects for employment, for improving their lives. So it's a very, very difficult time, I think, for a lot of people.
And in your conversations, what did people see as the origins of this discomfiture?
Well, you know, I mean, this is Russia. So people have sometimes a rather conspiratorial view of things. You know, they think that perhaps this is being orchestrated from without, and chiefly perhaps by the United States and Saudi Arabia. There might be some truth to that. We don't know, in terms of seeing if we can lower the price of oil to make things difficult for Russia, as you know, might have been done in the 1980s, and with quite devastating effects for Russia, and also for getting it to, I guess, behave a little bit better than they had previously from the U.S. perspective. Others, you know, take a just more fatalistic view and approach to all this, thinking that, well, it's just how things are, and we can tough this out, and at some point we'll come out from this, and things will be fine again. So it really depends on who you're talking to, what kind of response you get.
Well, let's talk a little bit about some of those indicators, like inflation, for example. That's increasingly becoming a problem.
Yeah, and you know, especially given how much of Russia's consumer sector is supplied by goods from West Europe, China, etc. So they've gone through this great deindustrialization over the past 2.5 decades. They import a lot of their consumer goods, and so that's generating inflation, and it will in that sector. Now, this also presents opportunities for Russia. So if they can find a way of, I guess, engaging in a kind of program of import substitution, perhaps beginning to produce more of their own goods again, this could actually be somewhat good for their economy. So it's a situation fraught with both opportunities and challenges.
Well, and how realistic is that? I mean, how quickly could they retool and embark on that trajectory?
Well, nobody really knows, of course, but to a certain extent, they've done this once before. So in 1998, when we had the ruble crisis, the value of the ruble collapsed because a kind of Ponzi economy had been constructed during the Yeltsin years, in which all of this foreign investment and money was coming in, propping up the ruble, and then eventually investors got scared, rightly, and left. The guy that was brought in to do triage on the Russian economy was Yevgeny Primakov, and he did a bang-up job. Now, of course, this was only 7 years out from the collapse of the Soviet Union, and he was able to fairly quickly reorient the economy, at least on this kind of temporary triage basis again, back to producing many of their own goods. They began to switch out or swap out many manufactured goods from abroad with what they were producing locally, but a lot of time has passed since then. And I don't know if they still have the same requisite technical expertise, equipment, etc. I guess we're going to find out. because there's a lot of incentives there for Russian producers to begin producing again. Prices are very competitive, given how high the cost is for foreign-produced goods. Will they be able to meet the challenge? We'll see.
And talk a little bit about the projected sort of macroeconomic performance in the coming year. We're talking about deep recession, aren't we?
Yeah, well, yes and no. So, I mean, the situation is certainly dire. There's no doubt about that. But it's not desperate at this point. Now, it could become desperate, but it's not yet. So we're looking at projections in terms of economic contraction of some 5 to 5.5% for this year. Quite serious. Not as bad as many countries in the 2008 crisis saw, especially in neighboring states like the Baltic states, which actually saw numbers in the double digits in terms of economic contractions. So difficult, but not impossible to deal with. Russia also does have some advantages in terms of its trade balance. So even though it does import lots of consumer goods, it's still a net exporter. Now, it's an exporter of primary products, and so commodities. And we're going to, again, see a decline in prices, perhaps even more so from what we have now, and so those revenues could go down. But, you know, it still has roughly a $200 billion trade surplus, so this is fairly significant. And then, of course, it has significant currency reserves. And if it doesn't just burn through all those trying to defend the ruble, which I don't think it will, its situation could be okay. Now, the really troubling thing is the level of private debt or corporate debt. So Russia doesn't have much in the way of government debt. So this is something that Putin took care of quite a while ago, seeing this as a potential kind of sword of Damocles hanging over their heads. Got rid of it, smartly, I think. But they have all of these big companies. I guess many of them we should say are kind of quasi-private. I mean, they're oligarch-run and they're heavily dependent on the state. So companies like Rosneft, for instance, the big oil giant, they have a lot of foreign debt. They're probably going to either default on that debt or they're going to have to go to the government to try and make these debt service payments, which are going to be very, very big. So this could use up some of the foreign reserves that the government has. So it's a very difficult situation in terms of how they're going to try and figure a way out of this.
So let's talk a little bit about one of the drivers of this situation, the sanctions. What kinds of sanctions are in place right now, and how are they really playing out in Russia?
Well, they've chiefly targeted these oligarchs that are close to Vladimir Putin. And so the idea has been to not so much to destroy the economy as to destroy a certain set of oligarchs that are fairly close to Vladimir Putin. They have had mixed results. I mean, they haven't brought the economy entirely down, which of course is not what is really the goal here. So it is a problem. Putin initially responded to this by actually using government reserves in order to kind of recapitalize, for instance, some of the banks that were targeted by these sanctions. So, you know, it's a matter of just how much more powder does Putin have at his disposal to fire back in the fashion that he has. But it hasn't, you know, really destroyed the economy by any stretch.
And the other big prong in this situation, of course, is the price of energy that you alluded to. So talk a little bit about why that's so significant in the Russian economy.
Well, for, say, the United States, oil, even though we have huge oil giants, these big companies, it's a relatively small part of our economy, and it's a negligible part of our government revenues. Well, the absolute opposite for Russia. For Russia, some 50% of government revenues come from oil. I mean, this is just absolutely massive. So when you have the price of oil, well, then you're facing, you know, a really big shortfall in terms of your budget revenues. Now, it's also some 11% of the economy. Now, that's big, but it's not overwhelming. It's not Venezuela-sized, for instance. I mean, in Venezuela, some 90% of the government revenues come from oil and a much bigger percentage of the economy as a whole. So potentially Russia can survive this, come out perhaps even potentially stronger. My thought on this is they need to kind of reprise the old Apple computer campaign of the late 1990s to think different. And this is what always frightens the United States, is when Russia begins to think different. Can they, for instance, as we said earlier, launch a successful import substitution drive? What would this mean for foreign investors? What would this mean for the rights of local investors within Russia? Would this be threatening to the United States or the international economic order? These are all questions which I suspect the United States has reflected on greatly, its policymakers.
Well, what about the idea of, we see this in many commodity-driven economies. There's always great lip service paid to diversification. And yes, we're just going to use this money in the short term and transition our economy. Why didn't that happen in Russia?
Well, it's interesting because Vladimir Putin certainly is aware of this problem. Just as you've said, many countries have actually looked at this right in the face. They understand the danger, but they don't do anything about it. Just as perhaps the people of Easter Island, when they chopped down the last tree, they understood, obviously, that there was a problem, but they didn't do anything about it. They chopped down that last tree. So Putin knows that Russia has been through this before. So in the 1960s, with the discovery of the Siberian oil fields and the export of oil, which began in that decade, and then with the huge escalation in prices in the 1970s, the Soviet Union saw this massive windfall from oil revenues. And then by the mid-1980s, early to mid-1980s, the price completely collapsed, and it left the Soviet Union in a very, very difficult position. So Putin has seen this before. He's known that it could potentially happen again. They have made some investments in terms of trying to diversify the economy, but just not very successfully. Now, not without some successes, but just not with the kind of success that they've needed. So, for instance, they had this big drive to invest in nanotechnology. Some fairly significant amount of money was invested there. Hasn't paid great dividends yet, but nonetheless, to my mind, a fairly smart thing to do. They're increasing the budget of their space program by some 300%, which I also think is a smart thing to do. Lots of spin-off technologies come from this. They have enormous equity stored in that sector that a new entrant, would just require decades to build up that same kind of knowledge and technical base. So they've done a little bit, but just not nearly enough. And of course, the obvious answer is that it's just too easy to collect these revenues to make lots of money. There are also some complaints about the lack of discipline within Russia. And by that I mean with top managers. And that Putin has been far too reluctant, somewhat in the same fashion of Brezhnev, to relieve people of their duties and for incompetence. And when he does, he just kind of makes a lateral move with them, gets them out of people's field of vision, but doesn't really make them pay a price in terms of their professional careers. Now, on one level, that might sound good given the history of Stalinism, but you can overcompensate and go the other direction. So I think that what many people don't understand is that Putin has a lot less power than they think. He's not Joseph Stalin in a lot of ways. This doesn't mean that he can't be a very unpleasant figure, and when necessary, even a brutal one. But he's managing a system with many complex, powerful, diverse interests, which he has to somehow all keep together. And if he moved too aggressively against the interests of too many of those oligarchs, he would lose his power base and he would be out of power.
Well, we'll talk a little bit about sort of the internal political dimensions of this story, but first we'll take a short break. We'll be right back with more International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back. We're taking a look at prospects for Russia in 2015 with Jeff Sommers. Well, before the break, we were talking a little bit about the economy. I'd like to shift gears a bit and talk about how this is playing in terms of just sort of the social fabric. And I'm going to start with the speech that Mr. Putin made at the Valdai Club. Mm-hmm. And first of all, tell us what the club is and talk a little bit about the speech, if you would.
Sure. Well, annually, President Putin convenes this group of important figures, VIPs, brings them to Russia, treats them very, very well, and they discuss the big issues of the day in terms of the economy, culture, politics, etc. And the idea is to have a forum which both provides a venue for the discussion of these big ideas, but which also perhaps flatters the participants as well and generates support and goodwill for Russia. Now, this year, I thought there were actually some very good things that were said in the speech. One of the themes that was focused on was, of course, Russia's future. Now, the speech occurred before the dramatic shift or drop that we've seen in energy prices. But it occurred, of course, after all of the business in Ukraine that we've seen recently this past year. So one of the things that Vladimir Putin was trying to convince people of, and I think he was being quite candid and honest, was that he's not interested so much in expansion. He spoke about the vast interior of Russia. You've got a country that still has some 10 time zones. If you take a look at Siberia, I mean, it's populated by only 6 million people, this huge, huge, huge territory. It's filled with all sorts of natural wealth, and they've really got their hands full just trying to maintain control of that and to try and also extract the wealth from it. Now, this, of course, doesn't mean that Russia is not interested in shoring up its borders, taking action such as we saw in Crimea, and the kind of interference that we still see in the Donbass region, which might be scaled back soon. But it was a very, to my mind, sober and sensible speech.
And in the West, it was largely portrayed as sort of a plaintive look back and the great betrayal of Russia at the hands of the West. I mean, did you hear any of that?
Of course. And that's always going to be there. And of course, Vladimir Putin, like many Russian leaders, has always seen Russia as a victim. And of course, Russia historically has often been a victim. It's also been an aggressor. So, and the two kind of mutually act upon each other. And it's very difficult sometimes to really determine which it is at any particular time. And sometimes it's both. I think there is something to the argument that the United States has too aggressively encroached upon Russia's former sphere of influence in terms of moving NATO in. While at the same time, I recognize that it's certainly within the rights of these new independent states to want NATO to defend them and to be in their countries and to be participants within this larger organization. But at the same time, the United States could perhaps exercise a little bit more control in terms of where it's acted to expand it. And it has resulted in these anxieties in Russia, no doubt.
Well, to what extent does that narrative continue to sort of influence events? And to what extent are there separate narratives? I digress for a moment. I was at a conference recently, and one of the speakers on this topic was talking about an incident in which some kids in a soccer field were killed by shelling in Ukraine. And in the Q&A, there was a Russian journalist who stood up and said, yes, of course that happened, and we know we have incontrovertible proof that it was Ukrainian shells that killed them. And so I mean, the basic fact pattern is in debate in so many situations.
Absolutely. That's what makes it very, very difficult because, of course, in Russia you have controlled media. And most people still get their information from television rather than the internet. And so the Russian government has advanced a very specific narrative, the one that we've kind of just discussed. And it's one that, to a certain extent, again, I can understand and even have some agreement with. But, you know, the Russian government, like all governments, perhaps a bit more than some, will make recourse to lying. It does provide a platform for conspiracy theories to be aired. And so, you know, we see a population, a lot of it, you know, which very much has these suspicions of the West, for lack of a better term, and sees themselves as being encircled and being aggressed upon. Now, again, to a certain extent, there's some truth to that, but it's really exaggerated by the government. And in fact, I would say that, I mean, it's not that the United States or NATO has any interest in taking any territory from Russia. I mean, I think the concern that Russians perhaps legitimately have is that over the long term, nobody knows what will happen. So an organization that today is benign, I think NATO is largely benign, tomorrow might not be. And by tomorrow, I mean 10, 20, 30 years from now. We just don't know what will happen. So from that perspective, I think they have a point. In terms of any short-term concerns about NATO, of course, they shouldn't have any. Now, with regards, though, to the Donbass, I think the Ukrainian government has used bombing and shelling in a very indiscriminate fashion in an attempt to actually bully the population into turning against the separatists. Now, there have been no shortage of lunatics among the separatist forces as well, which don't need any help from the Ukrainian military or government in order to get the people to turn against them. But at the same time, Ukraine's military has acted in a very heavy-handed fashion, and it has resulted in the deaths of lots of civilians, in addition to lots of suffering of non-combatants. And then, of course, we also have these kind of quasi-military organizations, paramilitary organizations operating in the Donbass from Ukraine, the Azov battalions, the Dnepr 1 battalions. These are being funded by various oligarchic interests and are not upholding any of the standards or norms of modern warfare in terms of what one should or should not do. Now, this is not to say that the same thing is not happening on the other side as well. So it's a very ugly conflict.
Well, you know, part of the strategy on Mr. Putin's part seems to be sort of fomenting this Mother Russia nationalist kind of thing. And is there a danger that, you know, people have often thought he could be challenged from the left and more liberal forces if he gets to the point where he has to reach some sort of accommodation on things like the separatist movement in Ukraine, that he's betrayed the people further to the right? And does he face the potential of a challenge from that quarter instead? Well,
that's a very good question, and you're absolutely right. He does. And in fact, this is what many people don't understand. While Vladimir Putin absolutely is a nationalist, and he does believe in some of this nationalistic rhetoric, a lot of it is actually deployed to appease this very kind of far-right nationalistic wing within Russia. And in effect, he has to try and control them. So he has to throw them some red meat periodically in order to do that. But figures such as Alexander Dugin, who I've met, and some others who are on the far right in Russia, you know, their goal was to see Russia invade Ukraine and just take it over. They don't recognize that the thing even exists. So Putin has this very delicate balance that he has to try and keep those forces in line without openly rebelling against him, and at the same time ensuring that they don't actually take over Russia's foreign policy. I mean, Putin is smart enough to know that that would be an absolute disaster for the country. If those forces ever took over, and you're right, I mean, this kind of rhetoric serves to fuel and feed them, that definitely could be very, very problematic for all concerned.
Well, we've just got a few minutes left. I'm wondering if we could widen it out a bit and look at what all the things we've been talking about tend to impact other issues that involve Russia, like Syria and Iran. And what can we look for in the coming months on that front? Are they going to be a lot less inclined to cooperate with Washington on those issues, do you think?
Well, it's interesting because the foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, just kind of lashed out a little bit at the United States and Germany for not cooperating with Russia currently on issues such as combating terrorism, saying that we need to kind of contain this as a separate issue, not have it being connected to Ukraine, and understand that we need to keep cooperating. I think that Russia would actually like to see continued and increased cooperation with the West on that score, but he's being marginalized. With regards to Iran and with regards to Syria, it's just really, really difficult to say. I mean, on one level, instability is actually something that could potentially help Russia in the short term if it led to, say, an increase in oil prices. At the same time, it certainly doesn't want instability anywhere near its borders or within its sphere of influence. So it's very difficult to tell what the Russians will actually do with regards to its foreign relations with Central Asia and the Middle East.
Well, like many stars, it's one to stay tuned and keep an eye on in the coming months. Jeff Sommers, thank you very much for joining us once again. To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website.